Know me already, but if not, my name is Lois. I'm the seminary intern this year at fourth year, and I actually attend McCormick Theological Seminary, where our speaker is from today. And I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Reggie Williams. He's a great teacher, mentor, friend of mine, so I'm so excited to have him here speaking with you all. Reggie is an associate professor of Christian ethics at McCormick, and he's the author of Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus, Harlem Renaissance Theology and an Ethic of Resistance, which was selected as a choice outstanding title in theology in 2014. Dr. Williams' current work continues to focus on the Harlem Renaissance by analysis of it as an aesthetic interruption of white supremacy, and a bid towards a better social ethics through a healthier understanding of what it means to be human and Christian. Dr. Williams and his wife Stacy are the parents of a son, Darian, and a daughter, Simone, and we're so excited that he'll be continuing the talks today that we've been having on Black history as it interrupts and informs our faith tradition. So let's welcome Dr. Reggie Williams.
Thank you, Reggie, for being here, but also acknowledge and welcome Stacy.
Yes, as I was reading, I was like, oh, and Stacy. She's here. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. My wife and I have been on the road. I was speaking to a group of people interested in Dietrich Bonhoeffer yesterday in Schaumburg, and this is how we're spending our weekend. After having just celebrated our 26th Valentine's Day. Yeah. So this isn't my first time here at Fourth Presbyterian. It's wonderful to be back. I'm glad to see some familiar faces. Lois is she's a sharp student, a very good student. You're lucky to have her. I mean that in all. Of course, lucky to have her here as one of our brightest at McCormick. But I want to spend some time. I won't go into a lot of preliminaries today because we have a short amount of time, and I've got some slides to show you. No matter how long people study or how old we get, it's much better to see pictures in cartoons than to just hear somebody speaking for 45 minutes. So what I hope to do is to illuminate what I'm talking to you about with some depictions that'll help to make sense, help this all to make sense. When Carter G. Woodson suggested Black History Week many years ago, it was because it was assumed that Black people had not made much contribution to civilization and society. But it's important to recognize that the very concepts of civilization and society are created. These are contrived, as strange as that may seem. In the process of creating civilization and society, the very understanding of human being is also invented. What we know today as concepts of, or the language of human difference, really is about as old as the United States and as young as the transatlantic slave trade. We are creatures who want to justify what we are doing. In that sense, we are somewhat naturally moral. We want to make an excuse. We want to argue why we did that. After something terrible happens, one of the first questions we ask is why? We want justification. And in the process, really, 300 years of unrestrained, unfettered access to Africans, we've come up with concepts to understand one another. All of that is invented. The practice or the effort to get to real human interaction is one of excavation. And we'll do a little bit of that today. We can't do much of it in 45 minutes or 50 minutes, but at least some encounter with it. Revelation. So I wrote a book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. How many have heard that name? Okay. I'm glad to see that. Some of you probably were in the class that I taught here about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Your pastor was emphasizing discipleship, and she thought it would be really helpful for us to understand what it means to live a Christian life on a daily basis. So we walked through Bonhoeffer's book, Discipleship, across the hall over here for a few weeks. He came to New York and studied at Abyssinian Baptist, he studied at Union Seminary, attending Abyssinian Baptist Church, which was a black Baptist church on 139th and Lenox Avenue in Harlem. That moment coincided with the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem Renaissance was a watershed moment in African American history where black people spoke for black people about who and what black people are. It was interrupting the narrative about black people that was set in the process of legitimizing black subhumanity and black ownership, being owned by white people. It was an interruption in that. That moment was really important to him while he was there. It helped him to recognize race as a Christian problem when he went back to New York. Back to Berlin, and offered his resistance to the Nazis. I have a few copies of that here, in case anybody was interested in that. I will bring some with me when I have them, because Amazon is terrible at the way that the prices fluctuate. I saw that book on Amazon for $50 at one point. I thought, that is just criminal. Somebody's making a whole lot of money off of that, and I'm not seeing it. So I will bring them with me on occasion when I have some. They're $30 if you were at all interested. So the title for today's discussion is something to do with black and white Christianities. And I named it, I've forgotten what it was. But it's something to do with black and white Christianities. You'll see the title there. If somebody has it, would you mind reading it? Hush Harbors. Christian. Okay. How many have heard the term hush harbors? Anybody? Hush harbors. You've heard it before. Would you be able to say what it? You've heard it. That's okay. You've heard it. Albert Rabbitoe, in his book Slave Religion, tells the story of enslaved black people as Christians. How does that happen? When I was an undergrad student studying theology, I wrote a paper on how enslaved people came to accept the religion of their captors. And there's some assumptions that are inside of that. First, that there were no enslaved Christians on the boats. That's an assumption. We know that there were enslaved Muslims on the boats. And one of my beloved colleagues at McCormick has written a wonderful essay about Christian Congolese who came over, and their Christian society made the colonists look like savages. That there were Christians on the boats on the way over. But there are also revivals in the United States, and large numbers of enslaved became Christians. Well, why would they do that? He tells the story of enslaved Africans sneaking away into the woods where they would pray and worship, sometimes with wet blankets hung on trees to keep the sound from getting out. They would sometimes kneel in a circle with the preacher in the middle. They would kneel and pray. And if somebody made a loud sound, slap a hand over that person's mouth, because they couldn't let the sound get out. They had to do it in private, in secret. Christians praying in private, in secret, in a Christian country. Why? Because it was illegal for them to gather together without a white person present to filter the language of Christianity that they were hearing. They wanted a kind of Christianity to be heard. In her book, Beloved, Toni Morrison has this wonderful depiction of the kind of Christianity that you may hear there. In this narrative, Baby Suggs, the woman preacher of the on the plantation where they're all gathered in the woods in Hush Harbors, delivers this sermon. Here, she said, in this place we flesh. Flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. And oh, my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them. Raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face because they don't love that either. You got to love it. You. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder, out there, they see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream from it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will soon snatch away, and give you leave-ins instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You got to love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here, flesh that needs to be loved, feet that need to rest and dance, backs that need support, shoulders that need arms, strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people yonder, hear me, they do not love your neck unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it and hold it up. And all your inside parts, that they just as soon slop for hogs. You got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it. Love it. And the beat and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet, love more than lungs that have yet to draw free air, more than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts. Hear me now. Love your heart, for this is the prize. The embodied nature of this Christian expression, your body in this world. Love it. That, we might say, is a picture of what it means to be Christian. Maybe even what we might say is something of the mission of the church, to value your embodied existence in this world. Listen, at this mission of the church, I look upon this world as a wrecked vessel. God has given me a lifeboat, he said, Moody, save all you can. The world is a sinking ship, and the church is a lifeboat. Save souls. Focusing on your souls, not the body, not the political situation, just saving souls. It's a very strict, stark contrast, wouldn't you say? Your embodied existence, where it is being either loved or hated. You make sure that you love it. Versus, I'm just concerned about your soul, your internal soul. Very different kinds of Christianities. One more. The early Christians rejoiced when they were deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. Hear that, to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. It was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. The church should not be just a thermometer registering the same principles and ideas that are present within society, in this case, about human beings, but a thermostat that transforms the values of society. Martin Luther King Jr. For the next, let's say, 30 minutes, we'll talk about some of those ideas in society that influence the way we express what it means to be Christian, live it in the church. The content that would be able to shape one's understanding of human, to leave or to threaten black people who would be gathering without a human, without a white person, is really old. You'll recognize this picture here. In the 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci is working on a math problem here. Solves a math problem. You can't really see it over there. But this is an effort, yeah, that might help. Thanks, hon. An effort to figure out how to fit a square into a circle. How would you fit a square into a circle? There's a mathematical response or answer to this question. You've seen this before, maybe even heard maybe some of you are aware of the math that goes into this. I took theology. I didn't want to study math. But the answer to this, in short, the answer to this equation is the human body, as they depict it here. The perfect proportion, dimensions of the human body. Extend that. The dimensions of the perfect body. The dimensions of the ideal body. The ideal human. This becomes an advertisement, kind of a template. Ideal human. European white male in the context of the age of discovery. Roughly about this time, Portuguese are interacting with Africa. The Portuguese, then the Dutch, and the British, the French, the Spanish. Fast forward quite a number of years, Carl Linnaeus is writing, a Swedish botanist is writing his book, Natural Systems. He's classifying all of life, rocks, plants, trees, animals, and so forth, placing them in taxonomies, like the human, in a taxonomy, writes the first taxonomy. I'm moving here really quickly. I've jumped 400 years, but during that time, there's been lots of interaction between Europe and Africa. Carl Linnaeus' taxonomy includes 5 types. Many have heard I ask these questions because it's always good to have interaction, but I've heard the name Linnaeus. Okay, very familiar. Yeah. Carl Linnaeus writes the first taxonomy of beings. This is a Swedish naturalist. He's helping us to understand. Now, what's fascinating about his taxonomy is it includes aesthetic features. It includes description of character and the way in which their politics work. He's describing the politic. One's ability to govern one's society is a part of the description of either the primitive, the savage, and so forth. What kind of organization do they offer to society? Do they have that, the ability to do that, or are they animals? The Americanus, he said, were copper-colored or red-skinned, obstinate, without content, stubborn of character, angered easily. His clothing was painted, the way that they comport their bodies. And they're governed by customs. You recognize what he means by the Americanus, of course. The Asiaticus, a whole lot of people in Asia, sooty, melancholy, and rigid. Some accounts of this taxonomy say yellow-skinned, easily distracted, haughty and covetous, covered with loose garments, governed by opinions. Europeanus, fair-skinned people, sanguine, brawny, blue-eyed, gentle of character, inventive minds, covered with close vestments. They dress or adorn their body appropriately. They're governed by laws. They're law-abiding people. Africanus, black-skinned, relaxed, phlegmatic disposition, black frizzled hair, silky skin, flat nose, crafty, indolent, meaning lazy, negligent. Like the red-skinned types, Africanus is not described as wearing clothing. They anoint themselves with grease and are governed by caprice, or rather, unpredictability. These illustrations actually were from a text by Josiah Knott and George Robbins Giddens in the illustration of indigenous races of the earth. And they're borrowing from, this taxonomy is very important for the description, the scientific understanding of human beings, is biological anthropology. This is the foundation for understanding human difference early in the 18th century. This is pictorial supplement to their argument that Negroes, as they would say, are a rank between chimps and Greeks. This is, what, 1957, so it is 8 years before the end of the Civil War in the United States. Some of the science of the time believed that if you, it's not going to show you, this laser is not going to show you, that the layout on the land of the earth was cause for some of the character defects that you will find in like African and so forth. The closer you get to the equator here, the hotter it is, the more challenging it is to farm. And their inability to farm adequately has a moral effect on them, a character effect on them. Even something, they even point to religion as well, and an aesthetic effect. If you move them away from the equator, their bodies will become white, and they'll become more moral and perhaps more intelligent. These were the early assumptions of how it happens in a lifetime that somebody would turn white. But the location on the grid here where the most beautiful and intelligent and moral types are in the 40-50 window. 40-50, you trace that all the way across, and it's just coincidental. It's just a total coincidence that the location of that argument is coming from Europe. Of course, it just objective analysis, purely objective. Finally, the monstrossus is kind of a waste bin category for peoples who come from areas uncharted, with even a belief in the Sasquatch as a type. Now, these scientists are doing more than just objective observation. Of course, I'm joking about that. It's more than just objective observation. But the language that they are adding to assumptions that are being made when they're seeing people become fixed in society's understanding of human difference. This idealized type has set in our minds the notion of a fully human type. One that we should all want both in leadership, that we esteem and see as ideal. What happens really within our common understanding of Christianity is that this human is equated with divinity. There's another way of putting it is that white and human come together in an idealized type. This idealized type ends up representing Christ. Christ puts together both white and human in this idealized, fetishized figure. This characterization of risen with all power having, I mean, I have another picture of this. It's easier to see that the stone wasn't rolled away. I mean, this is a retelling of the resurrection for a reason. It's not rolled away. And the angels here kneeling, perfectly proportioned blonde women at his feet, the one who is all powerful. And the stone has come down and slammed on a soldier and crushed him. And there's blood and a sword here. Happy Easter. That the representation here of the Almighty One with the women kneeling at his feet in perfect worship and submission. Also, perfectly proportioned women, perfectly proportioned creatures that you can tell aesthetically the ideal, or I should say the right proportions of femininity and the right depiction of masculinity as well. And these bodies are nothing like Africans. Later, or roughly, actually I should say at the same time, Karl Bloch's painting is 18th century. This, how many recognize this? What's being depicted here?
The angel flying in the sky.
Sure, who is she?
A woman.
Who is that woman? She is manifest destiny. American progress.
You won't be able to see the angel before you die.
She is carrying with her technology and knowledge the westward expansion of the human being, crowding out, pushing out the darkness of the Americanus. Later, Hitler is going to talk about Lebensraum. Same ideology, that there is a good colonization. It is when the Aryan, with technology and knowledge and culture, spreads that in the world for the advancement of humankind. There is a bad kind of colonization. A good and bad colonization. There's a bad colonization too. There's a bad kind. That is when the subhuman infiltrates the human. When the subhuman infiltrates the human, it sullies the human race and can destroy it. And in fact, in Germany, it had happened. And it was their duty as people who loved the human race to weed out that human infestation, that subhuman infestation, the Jew. So this connection between God's representation on the earth in Christ is with us today. I mean, without question, with us today. Part of pop culture, part of our daily engagement with Jesus as well. Both within the church, the walls of the church, you just look at the aesthetic representations, and in pop culture. I'll point to a couple here by way of reference. You've seen this, you recognize this movie here. Exactly. Exactly. When this scene happens here, his father tells him, you can save her, meaning Lois, who's plummeting to the earth. You can save them all. He floats out, superimposes his body over the earth in a pose not to be mistaken before he flies down to save the world. And just in case you think that that's a mistake, it's just coincidence, how about the moment when he's agonizing over whether or not to give himself up?
Hope, the destiny, and faith.
He's agonizing whether or not he's going to turn himself in. And so that you know, so that you don't miss what's going on there, they juxtapose him right next to this. What if Kal-El were depicted as a black man? I mean, that doesn't, though it's just a comic book, art and aesthetics are a reflection of cultural ethos. There's something more profound going on here. It's not just a movie. This is a reflection of the way that the white savior works in society and culture. The world needs her and him. And in addition to that, the world is better suited by him and her, and not the others that need help from him and her. That's a religious kind of presence. In her book, Stand Your Ground, which my wife is one of our co-teachers in a course that I've designed about the mission of the church at McCormick. She describes the United States, the American exceptionalism, as the language of the Anglo-Saxon myth. That Anglo-Saxonism is a myth about an idealized type who is a representation of God's ideal on earth as well. And that it's exceptionalism because the space is for the Anglo-Saxon. That the United States, built as an Anglo-Saxon place, is represented in its faith, in its religion, God and country. Now, I'm going to stop there for just a few minutes and check the temperature of the room. I've given you a lot. I'm going to make a transition here in just a moment. I'm kind of moving quickly without a script. Much of this, any of this, well, let's start this way. What's familiar? What have you seen that's familiar to you?
I would say the Superman image that occurred to me as I watched the movie, especially in one of the later ones where he'd been away from Earth for a while. He went to mad stuff in space, right. And he comes back, and you hear his father Jor-El saying, "I have sent my only son," and I said, "Oh my goodness." So this is the first time I've heard anybody else say what I thought and what I said to my wife when I heard it.
Right. Right.
Yeah, and I know you're talking about a man figure as well, but I'm thinking to other pop cultural references of like child saviors are always young white boys. So Harry Potter and even in the first Star Wars, right? The prophecy foretold of someone who will bring balance to the Force is a young white boy. So like these things keep recurring over and over. And even though culture is trying to shift it, it's still now like a white woman. You know, we can't quite get all the way over, but that image keeps coming up.
The other thing about that one, especially the white boy, has to do with general humanity and our ability to empathize. So society will empathize with that white boy over and over and over again, but when they see a black child, they see race, something particular, contingent. But the child, the white male child, everybody empathizes. I should say there's more of an opportunity. We're conditioned that way from birth. I mean, if you imagine from Leave It to Beaver, on upward, Father Knows Best. So from early age, we are conditioned by family situations on screen, people on screen, to have our experiences reflected back to us in people who look like the human. But a person of color does not have that. We represent something diverse here and here.
It's interesting that now Disney's coming out with animated films where there are children of color
Right.
as heroes, but the continuity is that there's an individual
Right.
that's the hero or the heroine, not from my understanding of African culture where there's a sense of community.
Right.
And this individualism is such a strong dimension of
That's
U.S.
Western.
culture.
Western. Yep. Here it was.
What was familiar was the continued narrative.
Yeah.
Always the same, that colors are less than the absence of color.
Right.
So that was familiar,
Right.
and it continued.
Right. What were you gonna say?
Yes, I agree. Superman's not only a god culture, it doesn't matter not only white but different colors of your skin, of Jesus' color. A little bit different with pop culture, like Star Wars after Man of Steel. That's a little bit different. God image.
Yeah.
So what was not familiar, sorry to flip it.
No, I was just gonna do that. Thank you for bringing us there now. Yeah.
I don't go to superhero movies. I don't think I've ever seen one on principle. And what, I should not be shocked, but the overt, like, juxtaposition that you've been showing us, it's like, are you serious? That really is that overt in the movie?
Yeah.
Yeah. And also Black Panther, gotta say, that's happening.
What's happening?
That movie, that superhero
Superhero.
movie representation.
Yeah. Now that shows something. That shows something of what the superhero is. To see the superhero depicted as black means what? From Africa means what? What does that mean? That that's happening in the cultural representation of all of the superheroes as white men and women for a society who is fantasizing about who we are. When the superhero is T'Challa from Wakanda, what does that mean then? What does that do to the narrative of the superhuman? You know, it does something. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that I don't know that it's only totally black, because the picture of the Danish Jesus was drawn by a guy out in Wheaton at one time. He doesn't exactly look like a Jewish Middle Eastern guy.
Now, it's interesting to say Danish or even French or Spanish, because that, I am not saying, is as toxic as white. What's happening here when Dutch or French, Spanish, Portuguese, Ashanti, Ewe, Jesus? White is something different. White is template human. That's different than the contextual, contingent, national, or even local representation as Jesus, who looks like Swedish people. To say white is to say the top of the human hierarchy, the template human. Whiteness is the structure that gives everybody else their difference, because you're human in aesthetic proximity to a white figure who, for example, you think people who came over here to this country, the Germans weren't white, Irish weren't white, Italians weren't white, but only in juxtaposition to the anchor for the concept of race, black people, did they have to assimilate into a white structure. White Jesus is the template figure, the representation of an idealized type who's saving the world. That's an important distinction to make. Anybody could agree that white is ideal. Anybody can do that, meaning that anybody can be white supremacist, can agree with that ideology as what we should like. And you see it all the time. Now, what this does also, what is needed here is a reflection of something that is missing what is present in the fully human ones. You need a counter. You may have heard of the term the looking glass self. I know that I'm tall because people tell me that all the time. And I come to recognize what that means in society because of that. I also notice other things about what it means to be in this body because of the way society responds to me. People will assume, and they're going to think that I played basketball, which in fact I did, because of my height and because I'm black. These are things that are assumed about me that may actually, it's interesting, did I play basketball because I wanted to, or did I play basketball because everybody thought that I should? Is the way that my engagement with society informs my understanding of myself. That's looking glass self. But I'm also a black man. And the way that people make assumptions about me as a black man and what I can and cannot do as well. That's part of what Judith Butler was describing as performativity, the way I'm read, and that there are demands upon my body to behave in a certain kind of way. To talk black is not to talk white. When I'm wanting to be masculine and to communicate masculinity as a teenage boy, I wouldn't dare do this. It's the right way of moving my body, the right way of talking. Well, whiteness has its necessary communicators. It describes all others. And it describes their right place in society. Some of the early artwork that you would find coming around from that time period of enslavement are telling that story. Now, when you look at this painting here, this depiction of happy black people, dressed nicely, enjoying themselves, you would need somebody else to tell you that life on the slave plantation wasn't like that. But in their right condition, as enslaved and under the care of the benevolent white savior sovereign, they're in their right place and they're happy. Because in fact, black freedom was illegal, sinful. This is where black people must be. Here, in this kind of experience of worship, they are fine. Everybody's taken care of, clean, shaven, dressed well. You would need somebody to let you know, to tell you explicitly that slave auctions are not like this. That the auction where families are being ripped from each other and sold is not a peaceful setting. It's a challenging one. That under the care of the benevolent sovereign, which was also a form of the right society, morally, holy, legally. This is the way that the society is described. I wonder what is present within that Christianity that could see through this. What does the Christian need to be able to recognize the immorality of content that's being described as moral in this moment? This could not happen without Christian support. The South is not just, and the United States in general, but in the South where this was held on to so hard, is not just a slave-owning society, it is a very biblical one. does one need in their faith to be able to see what baby Suggs was seeing?
It's scriptural. God's no respecter of person.
Which is scriptural?
You said, what does one need to see that's not?
To be able to see through this.
Yes.
Now it's, yes.
There has to be an ability to question and or challenge what the Christian believes to be the Word.
Yeah. So to question the Bible then, and your reading of the Bible you have to be able to do that. There's got to be openness, space to do that. I was teaching my intro to Christian ethics class. The first full-time faculty position I had was at Baylor University. And I offered them this engagement with Scripture. I said, reading what the prophet Samuel says to Saul, go and slay the Amalekites. Slay all of them and everything they own. Don't leave sheep alive, nothing. Slay them all. And in that same session, and then the next scripture I read to them was, love your enemies. Do good to those who harm you. From the Sermon on the Mount. And I asked them, these are both in your Bible, how do you read it? One white young man was disgusted with me. How dare you question God? That you would ask this, God said it. You don't question God. I'm not questioning God, I'm questioning you. How do you read this? How do you make sense of it? This is one of the tools that you use for moral reasoning. How do you make sense? There are ways that we do this that are very harmful. And in fact, one of the ways that Howard Thurman, the great black mystic, whose text, Jesus and the Disinherited, is a classic. In the text, he wants to retrieve Jesus not as a representative of European power and colonialism, but as a poor Jew in a colonized state. In other words, reading him historically and contextually. That's first way how you must recover Jesus. You got to see him historically and contextually. Howard Thurman was raised by his grandmother, who was, this is fascinating life, raised by his grandmother, who was born into slavery, lived a number of years as slave. He was born in Florida, and he died somewhere in the middle of the civil rights movement. You think of how much what he saw in his lifetime. Died in the 60s, raised by his grandmother, who was a freed slave. He said that his grandmother would ask him to read the Bible to her often, but don't read Paul. Don't read Paul to me. That's what the slave masters read. They used those texts. But I know that there is more in there, in that there is what's speaking from Jesus' mouth is talking to me. Read me Jesus. Because what was done with the Bible was done with our understanding of human being. Our understanding of human being was meant to support the superior humanity of the human one, the white ones, and the inhumanity of the black. In 1865, when the Civil War ended, there were 4 million formerly enslaved black people who were no longer legally bound to white people. Then the narratives changed from the contented, happy Negro to sleep and eat, lazy, and dangerous.
Did you know what the population of the Southern whites were at that time?
That's a good question, and I'll find that out now that you ask that. It hadn't even occurred to me. because the numbers that stick with me are 500,000 brought over. I'm sorry, 5,000. No, that's right, 500,000 brought over. 500,000 brought over in chains from Africa legally during the slave trade. 500,000 brought over. And that ended in 1808, the legal transmission of Africans to the colonies. Yet in 1865, there were 4 million. Between 1808 and 1865, what happened? This is the narrative that sticks in my mind, rather than answer your question, which I will get to. That's a good question. And it's important to recognize that what happened was not all of a sudden they started breeding a whole lot more, but there was something else that was happening here. The internal trade, which included breeding farms, they were forcing black people into. The unrestrained access to black bodies for more than 300 years spun off an ideology to legitimize what they were doing with those bodies. The language of the violent buck, sexually deviant violent buck, and the sexually deviant black woman was all legitimizing what was happening to them. But black people were doing something different with that very narrative of the gospel. Not the ideal type on a cross, on the Sunday morning, risen with all power, crushing his enemies with his women kneeling at his feet. Here, William H. Johnson is showing a connection with Christ that's different. This connection with Christ is in suffering. Not perfectly proportioned human bodies, but differently proportioned bodies. Hands that look like workers' hands. This is how they make their living, big. This source is a large part of their livelihood. Worshiping and standing and connecting in the suffering. Or figuring out how to make it through the day-to-day with the general expectations of the day for this black man and his family. He's a janitor in the daytime. But in the evening, he paints. Which is he? The janitor or the talented painter? He's painting his friend here. This is Palmer Hayden, Harlem Renaissance artist. And then one last one here, without describing how he put this together. I grew up knowing this narrative. And I will say that I've started this by this section, or this session with you, by describing different notions of the mission of the church. And we read Baby Suggs' Sermon in the Clearing. We read Dwight L. Moody's understanding of the mission of the church. We read Martin Luther King Jr.'s mission of the church. It's not such a clean line between like white and black Christianity. What we have is several different kinds of Christianities that come from traditions here in the United States. Some traditions are completely unexamined in the ways in which they were born in the process of trying to legitimize theologically our practice of domination. Practices of domination and submission. While other streams of thought recognize horrific problems and resist that. But to do that, they've got to do more than just think about life after death. They've got to engage embodied existence. This tradition that I'll show you here was one that I was raised with. It's making sense of suffering for black people. Now, one of the ways I get at this is to ask the question, where is Jesus? Because I've asked you that question, now you're thinking, oh, he's not carrying the cross. Maybe he's not carrying the cross. Or is he carrying the cross? Where is he in this painting? It's most common, of course, because Jesus was crucified and this person is carrying a cross and they're soldiers. But this is not Jesus. Jesus is here with a halo around him, around his head, and with the soldiers looking on. Well, who is this person? Simon. Simon of Cyrene. Simon from Cyrene, Cyrene, North Africa, Africa, black people. This is a tradition that I was raised with. This is the fifth station of the cross. When Jesus couldn't carry his cross anymore, they laid the cross on Black Simon. And when Black Simon's body touched the cross, Black people picked up the suffering of Jesus. Suffering with Jesus. Suffering with Jesus. It's interesting to think about the implications of that then. And they laid hold on Simon, Black Simon, yes, Black Simon. They put the cross on Simon, and Simon bore the cross. What does this mean for the people who were responsible for Black suffering? What does this mean for the people who were responsible for the suffering of people who were crushed, marginalized in society? Where your Christianity does not have a horizontal perspective at all, does not look at embodiment, is not concerned about embodiment or embodied experience, isn't concerned about the earth, embodied experience, or political systems and structures that harm people, but primarily concerned about right doctrine in life after death. It had to be concerned about right doctrine in life after death, nothing embodied, because it was working to legitimize something. Christianity becomes about right belief and about life after death. This is Christianity like farmer's insurance, fire insurance. So there are many different ways that we can sort through some distinguishing features of different kinds of Christianities. But I just laid that out it's a bit of a dualism, which is not very, very representative, but you got an exposure to different types here this morning for conversation. And I think we're ready to have a bit of conversation in the few minutes we have left. We can hit the lights there again. So I'm done with the presentation so far. Let's hear from somebody who has not talked yet, though. Let's go. If we can.
So Reggie, when you say you were raised with this, what are you saying? Are you saying that you were in the church that you were a part of? Black people understood themselves to be in solidarity with Christ, sharing the suffering of Christ, or what are you saying? From
my earliest memories, I heard this story, and it wasn't in one Black church. This was. My grandmother went to a really Black Nazarene apostolic church, and I knew this from her experience. She would just talk about this in home. And then there were several other Black churches that I went to: a Missionary Baptist Church, Apostolic Church. I now go to Trinity United Church of Christ. But this theme here is fairly common within Black Christianities. The fifth station of the cross. Black people are in the Bible first. Black people are in the Bible. This is the language right here. Black people are in the Bible. Cyrene is North Africa, and when they asked a Black man to carry that cross. And it's because Black people were carrying that cross. I just knew this. I heard this growing up all the time. This is part of my experience. I think there are other Black people in the room who also could say the same thing. You're nodding. You know that, yeah. And Albert Rabateau also says that Black churches, traditions of Christianity, all share a common origin. We share a common origin in hush harbors. Those communities that would steal away to worship are what birthed what became Black church denominations and Black communities. So this theme of suffering with Jesus, no doubt, was there in the secret worship. Yeah.
So I'm recalling when I was a seminary student in McCormick, on a Good Friday, I went to First Presbyterian Church in Woodlawn, which was primarily Black congregation, and they passed out spikes that were huge. Every single person took one and then processed to the front and put it into the cross.
Wow.
And the ritual, I don't even remember what words were spoken, but it embodied, for me, that the people were expressing their own being crucified.
Yeah.
Is that part of what you're, I guess I'm still wondering what the narrative, sharing in the suffering of Christ, how does that narrative shape your relationship with God? Or
So James Cone would say that if God was with Christ in Christ's suffering, then we are not alone. Then God is with Black people in our suffering. And just as he raised Jesus in the life of the first church community, Sunday's coming for us too. This is how we make sense of what's happening in the absurdity of Black life in the United States. No, I think was there one right over here? Oh, here too. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks. And the stark difference, at least for this one white woman who's been in the church her whole life, I never thought of Simon of Cyrene. Never. Growing up. Yeah. I mean, I didn't even think of him as being Black. It's just so bizarre to me when I keep running up against these experiences. You know, how different we have been raised. That white supremacy is just so huge.
Yeah, it really takes. Dolores Williams talks about, she's a womanist scholar who talks about Hagar. She names her the experience of Black women as Christians routes it through Hagar, Ethiopian.
I was going to say about Simon. I attended the first class a couple of weeks ago on this subject, and the one thing Hollywood got right, and the greatest story ever told, was Sidney Poitier with Simon.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I have to go back and watch that because that Jesus is crazy looking. I mean, but yeah. Looked like he's about 50 years old too, and very white. Sure. Yeah, but interesting. Sidney Poitier was Simon.
Paul Robeson was Simon as well in an earlier depiction.
Oh wow!
So that's going back way far.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. You had your hand.
I was, in response to one of your questions, I was just going to say that I think Black people have an acknowledgement, an acceptance, and an affirmation of a very special relationship with Christ. And not to challenge Jews as the chosen people, but an acknowledgement that Blacks are chosen as well, and also have a very special relationship with Christ because of the shared suffering. Because how else, without that, could a people survive?
Yeah, and it's important to recognize the juxtaposition to oppressive political structures. This is what's happening here. An empire that is crushing the most harmed of society. One more just. This is and it's actually an Israeli situation. The Jews constantly next to imperial structures, from the Philistines to the Babylonians to the Egyptians, to the Romans, so forth. It's constantly the language of justice is a very Jewish language, over and against imperial structures. And Jesus going to the temple and turning over the table the money changers and doves and driving them out with a whip, people look at that as like selling trinkets at a holy site and him being upset. But it's William Herzog, biblical scholar, points out that the table of the money changers and the doves were specific tables. You couldn't use regular denarii, Jewish money, at the temple. You had to exchange it, and there was a charge for that. And then to exchange it, they needed to buy the sacrifice for the poor people sacrifice, which was the doves, which is birds. These were, as Herzog says, street level. It was a street level representation of corporate interests. And Jesus turning over those tables was protesting exploitation of harmed people. of economically harmed people.
Unfortunately, we're at time, but I did want to say one last thing before we close out and say thank you, is that you asked a question. You said, what does this mean, this image, for white Christianity and those that have been raised in white Christianity? And it made me think, as a white Christian, that if the suffering of Jesus is implemented by the Roman soldiers and the Roman soldiers put the suffering on Simon, then white Christians ipso facto end up identifying with the Roman soldiers. Like,
right.
We are at the boot of the empire, or white Christianity has been.
Right.
So.
As though Jesus were born in Herod's palace or something.
Right, right.
Not in the.
So anyways, thank you so
Sure.
much. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.